Hello, my name is Daniel Webster. I'm director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Policy and Research. Actually, we were just renamed ourselves, the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Prevention and Policy. That's how new it is. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm really thrilled today that we will have Dr. Jennifer Carlson, who's going to lead a conversation based upon her research and her new book, Policing the Second Amendment. Dr. Carlson is an associate professor of sociology, government and public policy at University of Arizona, where she teaches courses on guns, rights, trauma, justice, and law. Her award-winning research examines how guns shape American life, including those who survived gun violence, harrowing aftermath, police who enforce the country's complex gun laws, gun sellers, and retailers who are on the front line of surges in gun purchasing, and people who choose to own and carry guns. I'm going to pause just a minute because I'm not sure everybody has joined. Okay. Everybody has joined. Okay. I mentioned Dr. Carlson's new book, Policing the Second Amendment, Guns, Law Enforcement, and the Politics of Race. These are obviously very important and timely topics. It'll cover some of the research she's done she's interviewed over 6 dozen police chiefs in Arizona, California, and Michigan. Following her presentation, we're going to have 2 of our doctoral students who will be discussants for Dr. Carlson's work, Mudia Uzzi, who is a 3rd-year doctoral candidate in the Department of Health, Behavior, and Society at Johns Hopkins. His research examines structural drivers of community violence and trauma in Baltimore City, including redlining, economic segregation, and built-in social environments. We'll also be joined by Nick Meyerson. He's a doctoral student in health policy and management at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. His research interests are firearm policy, racial ethnic disparities in firearm violence, and youth violence prevention. I'll hand it over to Dr. Carlson.
Let me go ahead and share my screen. That's excellent. Okay. So thank you so much for inviting me here to share my research. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And I want to thank in advance the organizers and the discussants for making this possible, the conversation that we're going to have. It's an honor to have this conversation in this venue, as well as to have it in this particular moment, a moment that I think holds out an invitation for transformation with respect to gun violence in the US. Okay, so let me get my PowerPoint going. All right, so to unravel that invitation requires that we start by recognizing the significance of race as a vector along which gun violence is experienced and understood. So people of color are disproportionately likely to be victims of gun violence, particularly African Americans and African American boys and young men, who are 20 times more likely to die of gun homicide than their white counterparts. Gun homicide statistics, of course, barely scratch the surface of the uneven brunt of gun violence with respect to race. Gun deaths and injuries leave individuals, families, friendship circles, and communities impacted psychologically, socially, financially, politically. And as a society, we have yet to grasp the full reach of gun trauma. But communities of color are already well aware, which helps illustrate the racial differences in whether gun violence is considered a big problem in the US and whether further gun restrictions are needed. Accordingly, gun control and gun regulations are often seen as necessarily beneficial to communities of color, a sentiment communicated in this headline from the Washington Post here that says, "We can't advance the goals of Black Lives Matter without addressing gun control." That stance, however, simplifies a more complicated and somewhat ambivalent dynamic between the politics of race and politics of guns. After all, guns have long been tools of protection and resistance among African Americans, particularly in the face of apathetic and even aggressive law enforcement. Writing in 1892 against the lynching of African Americans, Ida B. Wells noted that the Winchester rifle should have a place of honor in every Black home, and it should be used for that protection which the law refuses to give. More recently, in 2020, African Americans appear to have turned to guns as tools of self-defense in surging numbers. As pandemic uncertainties loomed, democratic instability threatened, and as perhaps a 21st century remix of the 19th and 20th centuries lynching terror, hate crimes and police violence austerely reminded African Americans of the law's refusal of protection. According to the National Shooting Sports Foundation, perhaps as many as 56% more African Americans purchased guns in 2020 as compared to 2019, the highest increase among any racial group. Now, the facts and figures of the previous two slides intimate a tension between two major movements of the 21st century: the movement for criminal justice reform, including the prison abolition movement, Black Lives Matter, and now defund the police, on the one hand, and the movement for gun control on the other. While African Americans are situated at the noxious intersection of harms caused by both the criminal justice system and gun violence, the relationship between these two movements does not represent a natural alliance, because under the war on crime, gun control has often taken the form of gun criminalization in the US, and thus threatens to not just reflect but also reproduce the dynamics of racist harm more broadly endemic to the US criminal justice system. After all, it is often the same police agencies who disproportionately harass, arrest, and kill people of color, particularly African Americans and Indigenous peoples, who are also charged with enforcing gun laws. So despite the centrality of public law enforcement in contemporary gun policy as its key enforcers and at times crucial endorsers, the relationship between public law enforcement and gun policy has been largely overlooked. So in my book, Policing the Second Amendment, I aim to address this oversight by engaging three questions. First, how has the racial politics of policing shaped and been shaped by gun politics? How do police understand and justify the use of guns as legitimate violence, and for whom? And how should this impact how we craft gun policy? Now, in posing these questions, I aim to question also the notion that police are natural allies, either to gun control or gun rights advocates, but rather I aim to situate their position on gun policy within the broader politics of race that saturate both the politics of crime and crime policy and the politics of gun policy. After all, supporters of gun control often imagine police to be motivated to support gun control by virtue of the unique professional dangers that they experience. A disarmed, or at least a lesser armed populace stands to increase police safety and perhaps also decrease the use of police force as well. Now, the problem with this reasoning, however, is that the police themselves don't buy it. So during the research for my first book, Citizen Protectors, I began to understand this as concealed carriers told me that they saw themselves as helpers of the police and insisted that police too saw the gun carriers, as good for public order. So soon after, the Detroit Chief of Police, James Craig, pictured here, appeared on the cover of the NRA's magazine, America's First Freedom, embracing concealed carry for those legally eligible, noting that Detroit's crime rates and the police's slow police response time made carrying a gun not just an understandable act, but a courageous one as well, one that could keep someone from being a victim. Now, while I heard many quips on law enforcement during my research on gun carriers for citizen protectors, such as I don't dial 911 or I carry a gun because a cop is too heavy, it was not until I found myself, in fact, in the office of a chief of police in Arizona doing research for Policing the Second Amendment that I saw this sign stipulating that I plead the second, which is particularly paradoxical given that it is a riff on a Supreme Court decision, the Miranda decision, largely seen to clip the power of the police. Indeed, Pew data suggests that police overwhelmingly support gun rights over gun control. So not only do police support gun rights over gun control by a ratio of 3 to 1, they also support gun rights overwhelmingly more so than the general public. Likewise, while there is consensus between the police and the public regarding mental health screening and background checks, in other regards, police are less likely to support particular gun regulations, such as a federal database to track gun sales or a support on assault weapons. So today, my focus is on the following claim. that we must consider the racial politics of policing to understand, engage, and move forward in the gun debate. So I'm going to build my case for this claim through 3 exhibits drawn from my book. And I admit that this is ambitious, and so if I have to cut myself off in terms of time, we may not get to everything, but hopefully we will. So first, Exhibit A, the gun debate in blue, will attempt to answer the question of how the racial politics of policing has shaped and been shaped by gun politics by providing a historical reading of the gun debate from the early 20th century that centers public law enforcement. So in doing so, I show that racist tropes about crime and criminality emanating from the police, but also from society more broadly, have long galvanized the gun debate in expected and unexpected ways. Second, Exhibit B, gun militarism and gun populism, brings this historical debate to the present day, examining how contemporary public law enforcement understand the politics of guns, and particularly how they draw lines between the good guys with guns and the bad guys with guns, and between criminal violence and legitimate violence. Now, just to be clear, I'm not making a normative stance by calling something legitimate. I'm actually using the Weberian sense of that, of Max Weber, the sociologist, and defining legitimate violence as those capacities for and deployment of physical coercion that can be justified by recourse to law, justice, and authority. So as we will see, race shapes both how police understand gun control and gun rights policies, forcing us to rethink the terms of the gun debate beyond its traditional coordinates. Third, Exhibit C, gun law enforcement as racialization, provides insight not just into what police say, but also what they do. So by using the enforcement of concealed pistol licensing to explore how racist tropes shape the terms on which people are able to carry or able to receive a license to carry a gun, I call attention not just to how gun policy is written, but how it is also enforced, which I argue contains crucial lessons for how we imagine and craft gun policy. So while recognizing that police have long been central to gun policy, even as they have been largely overlooked other than as sought after allies, my goal is to open space to imagine a different kind of gun politics, one in which police are decentered and one that does not replace one trauma, that of gun violence, with another trauma, that of criminal justice. Okay, so getting into my evidence. So my analysis here depends on comparing Arizona, California, and Michigan, which are 3 states that share a similar project of tough on crime politics, which has resulted in the disproportionate representation of racial minorities in the criminal justice system. They do, however, have vastly different gun policy regimes, and I'm happy to get into more details with these different regimes during the Q&A. So Arizona is my gun lax state. It has largely deregulated gun ownership and gun carry to the extent allowable by federal law. Michigan is my gun permissive state. So most of what is legal in Arizona is also legal in Michigan. The difference, however, is that Michigan requires licensing and registration in most cases. So this means it has a more robust but still gun rights friendly apparatus for enforcing gun laws. And finally, California is the gun restrictive state. It heavily regulates gun ownership and has its own assault weapons ban at the state level, ban on high capacity magazines, and even bans on certain handguns, and it has a robust enforcement apparatus. So as you will note throughout my presentation, I use historical and legal analysis to situate these states in the broader national context of gun politics and gun policy. Now, in each of these states, I interviewed a diverse swath of police chiefs, well, geographically diverse. I wanted to move beyond analyses of public law enforcement that focus on urban policing in order to integrate suburban and rural experiences as well. As you will see, though, they are not at all diverse in terms of demographics. And I think this is an important note to make for those who advocate police diversity as a solution or as a means of police reform. As you can see from my breakdown here, the demographics of the top brass are very homogenous, white, male, and in their 50s. So why police chiefs? I focus on chiefs because they have decades of policing experience and can provide insight into how gun laws and gun violence have intersected with policing over time. So further, police chiefs must interface with the public, especially on issues such as use of force. And so they're illuminating interview subjects with regard to the popular justificatory narratives regarding gun policy, gun politics, and gun violence, both by private civilians and by police. My final piece of evidence centers on gun boards. And these are public forums in which claimants can contest the denial, revocation, or suspension of a concealed pistol license. And if you haven't heard about gun boards, there's a reason for that. They're actually very rare. Michigan was one of the states that actually had public gun boards when I did my research in 2014. I studied 2 county level gun boards that serve very different populations, an urban economically depressed area, including Detroit, that was disproportionately poor and African American in Wayne County, and a wealthier, whiter suburb in Wayne County. Now, in both of these counties, people were called to gun board for a variety of reasons, ranging from active restraining orders to a referral by a local police. And you can see some of the various reasons on the screen. And at the time of my research, nearly every member of gun board was a current or retired police officer, which meant that I was able to observe in action how police put into practice the ideas about gun politics and gun policy that I heard in my interviews with police chiefs. Now, as many of you are well aware, gun records are generally sealed. And so this lack of data availability speaks to the methodological difficulties in rigorously examining the impact of American gun laws, particularly with regard to racial disparities. So my observations were possible in this case because Michigan's county level gun boards were public. I could attend them, observe the cases. They were public at the time of my research. However, I want to emphasize that this is no longer the case. Michigan closed the door to its county level gun boards at the end of 2015 when gun licensing decisions were centralized in an effort to standardize licensing procedures and actually shift licensing fees from counties to the state. So these observations represent a rare opportunity for systematic and in-depth analysis of racial differences in contemporary gun carry licensing. Okay. All right, sorry, I'm just checking the Q&A. Will the PowerPoint presentation be available after the webinar? I can't answer that question right now because I think there's going to be a recording available, but I'll leave that to the organizers to answer at the end of my presentation. Okay, so let me get back into it. All right, so with that evidentiary overview, I want to start to tease apart what we can learn about gun policy and gun politics if we pivot to a focus on the police. So while 20th century policing scholars often understand police identity to be indelibly connected to the quote, gun in the badge, this is a phrase you see a lot in police research, guns actually did not become standard issue for public law enforcement in the US until well into the 20th century. So as police underwent professionalization in the early 20th century, the National Rifle Association actually played a crucial role in promoting the notion that police should be armed and should be proficient in guns and gun training to fully achieve their potential as crime fighters. So as early as 1916, the NRA's Frank J. Kars explained, when the time comes and every policeman is capable of drawing his revolver or pistol with the least possible delay and shooting it accurately, the lawbreakers, who now hold little fear of the policeman's aim, will think twice before drawing their fire. Then and not until then will the criminal element have respect for the policeman's revolver. So this promotion of guns and gun training to public law enforcement was fully in line with what political scientist Matthew Lacombe in his new book Firepower calls the NRA's quasi-governmental phase. So the beneficiary of federal funding, the organization hosted firearms competitions, organized rifle clubs, assisted in training and education for civilian enthusiasts and military members alike. Turning its purview to police was a natural extension of this orientation. By 1960, the NRA founded its own law enforcement division without much fanfare. As an article in Police magazine describes upon the 50th anniversary of the division's founding, the division had trained upwards of 50,000 police officers. But perhaps more crucially, the division laid a foundation for the NRA to assert itself as an ally to police, an assertion that would take on growing significance as the 1960s unfolded. Now, there is much to be said about the 1960s and how it transformed the politics of guns. The rising specter of gun violence, whether in the form of high-profile assassination, civil unrest, or surging interpersonal crime, led people across the political spectrum to focus on guns either as objects of danger or objects of protection. So the 1960s is the decade that one of the few major pieces of federal gun legislation was passed, the 1968 Gun Control Act, but the 1960s is also the decade during which, for the last time, Americans in the majority, according to Gallup data, supported a ban on handguns. So after the late 1960s and onwards, Americans viewed a ban on handguns as less and less appealing, and instead, over coming decades, millions opted for concealed pistol licenses. So the war on crime, as legal scholar Jonathan Simon notes, transformed the politics of guns by welding it to the politics of crime and situating guns primarily in terms of defense against criminals, largely and racistly stereotyped as Black men. In an era of tough on crime politics in which the threat of crime did not just galvanize aggressive criminal justice responses, but also excited an acute sense of vulnerability and anxiety among people in the US, guns provided an appealing stopgap of protection, even as they also figured as newfound tools of danger. So on the front lines of this surging tough on crime politics were police and their guns. The war on crime was not just a metaphor for them. In many ways, police began understanding themselves as warriors in a fight against crime and began arming up accordingly. It was not uncommon for police to seize firearms from local gun stores as they aimed to quell riots and unrest. Such a thing happened, for example, during the 1967 Detroit riot. Afterward, Detroit police officers actually joined the NRA en masse as the organization made it easier for officers to obtain discounted military surplus. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, then Officer Daryl Gates of the LAPD, for example, came up with the idea of a specialized militarized police unit, SWAT, which with some of his fellow officers in the aftermath of the Compton riot in 1965. By 1969, the unit was tested on live television as it raided the Black Panthers. By the time the 1980s unfolded, police began increasingly feeling themselves outgunned in what they saw as an urban war on crime, galvanized by racist tropes of gangbangers, thugs, and by the 1990s, super predators. Police saw themselves as casualties in the war on crime. Now, while the mass shooting in Stockton, California in 1989 is often credited with galvanizing the momentum behind California's assault weapons ban and eventually the national ban as well, the groundwork was already being laid in how police began understanding themselves as victims of gun violence. Testifying about the assault weapons ban, LAPD's Daryl Gates noted, "My police department has already lost 2 officers who were killed by assault weapons. I do not want any more officers to be spray gunned to death by street punks armed with high-tech killing machines." Likewise, San Jose's police chief Joe McNamara noted in 1988, "Our cops are outgunned. Daily, the guys in blue are coming up against semi-automatic weapons, handguns, and assault rifles capable of firing 15 to 30 rounds of 9mm ammunition in a few seconds." So from this vantage point, the assault weapons ban and other gun laws endorsed by California police were akin to almost an article in the Police Officers' Bill of Rights that some states had come to pass during the war on crime, the right not to be outgunned by criminals. Stiffer gun laws were about protecting police and enhancing their firepower as crime fighters in an urban war on crime. Thus, police entered into the gun control debate on the gun control side, complicit with the war on crime. Police need to disarm and overpower the enemy. Eventually, police support was crucial in passing what had been hailed as a watershed gun control. First, an assault weapons ban in California, and later a federal ban. But unlike the push for gun control in, for example, England, which focused on protecting child victims, or the mobilization for gun restrictions in Canada, which centered on protecting women, efforts to pass American gun regulations also emphasized the police's own engagement in urban warfare, which sheds light on why US gun control so often comes with strings attached with respect to the police. After all, Clinton's crime bill not only restricted guns in the hands of civilians, it also provided funds to hire more police officers and created the Office of Community-Oriented Police Services, a program that would ironically help to expand police militarization in years to come. For their part, the NRA, though, never lost its focus on police, even as the 1980s and 1990s strained their relationship. Like gun control advocates at the time, the NRA largely endorsed the racial politics of the war on crime and jostled to harness them to its advantage. As the assault weapons ban and other forms of gun control were being debated, James Baker, an NRA lobbyist, for example, made the NRA's tough on crime stance clear. As he says, rather than prohibitive firearms regulations, Americans could have it both ways, an aggressive criminal justice state and lenient gun laws. The sentiment is captured in the mantra popularized by gun rights advocates, crime control, not gun control. Now, while my book provides more details on how the NRA rebuilt its relationship with the police in 1990s and beyond, I want to call attention to a few ways that the NRA cultivates ties with the police and encourages members of the law enforcement community to also become members of the NRA. So the NRA, for example, provides line of duty death insurance for families of fallen officers. It recognizes Officers of the Year and provides them with accolades. It publishes media directed specifically at law enforcement and their interests. And finally, it provides small grants to police departments, including, for example, the Detroit Police Department, that received a small grant from the NRA. Now, the NRA has also worked to legislatively protect and expand police prerogatives. So, for example, the Law Enforcement Officers Safety Act of 2004 is a law that allows active duty police officers to carry a gun off duty while outside of their jurisdiction. The law had met resistance in the 1990s. Police and policymakers were concerned about the unevenness across police agencies in terms of department policies, rules regarding the use of of force, firearms training, and community demographics and crime trends. The surging public consciousness surrounding active shootings and terrorism, however, soon made these concerns less pressing, at least compared to the palpable public approval for preventative and first response measures. The NRA's advocacy of this law illustrated the organization's crime control, or gun control is not crime control, or arguments. It expanded the police's prerogative to fight dangerous criminals, but to do so, it likened off-duty cops to a reserve army of would-be first responders. So in doing so, this law shrank not just the rhetorical distance between off-duty police and private armed civilians, but also the legal distance between laws that protect police and laws that empower ordinary civilians with respect to self-defense. Indeed, within the pro-gun community, in some circles, this law is actually sometimes treated as a first step to national concealed reciprocity for civilians. So this brief overview of the gun debate suggests that police are interested parties in the politics of guns, and that their views may be as much about guns per se as reflections of the broader currents and the deeper currents driving the politics of crime and the politics of race. So turning to my interviews with police chiefs, I found that police chiefs' understandings of gun violence could not be disentangled by the social geographies in which they imagined gun violence to be taking place. And that these divergences were key not just to understand sort of how police understood gun violence out there, but also how they understood their own guns, as well as how they understood guns in the hands and holsters of private civilians. So during my research, I heard many stories of gun tragedy, gun violence, and gun terror, of close encounters with stray bullets, and of aggressive action taken decisively. For example, one chief in a high crime area naturalized urban gun violence by explicitly appealing to the demographics of the city. He said, "We have gang issues, and that's connected to us having a low income community and a high minority rate. We are 70% Hispanic, so that sort of goes hand in hand. Our crime rates have dropped about 25%, but here the gun violence is still people shooting people." Another chief in a jurisdiction that bordered a high crime area likewise spoke a language of containment. He said, "We are concerned with making sure that gang violence does not spill over. As we say, we like to keep our enemies on the other side of the gate." And finally, blurring the lines between perpetrators and victims, chiefs at times actually tallied the homicides in non-gang related and gang related categories separately as they explained their cities or jurisdictions' terrain of gun violence. They resisted labeling those who die in gang violence as victims, but instead criminalized them. So one officer or one chief noted, "I would say that gun violence is my number one concern. 90% of it is targeted. It's people who are involved in a criminal lifestyle." So by narrating urban gun violence as a localized issue of bad people from bad places doing bad things, to paraphrase, this stylized version of crime narrowly defines urban gun violence, and it defines urban gun violence in strikingly different terms than the kinds of gun violence imagined to take place in suburban and rural areas. So whereas police naturalize gun violence associated with people of color as endemic to urban spaces, police actually denaturalize gun violence associated with suburban and rural spaces, such as active shootings. So as one chief told me, "Something can happen in the strangest of places. I wouldn't go to church without a gun." Now, this formulation of strangest places is telling. The church, the school, the workplace, none of these are necessarily strange places with respect to violence, except by virtue of their racial and class marking. In other words, they are public equivalents to the private sanctuary of the white picket fence, places that should be peaceful and serene under the broader projects of racial and class exclusion that make them possible. Now, in this way, police chiefs often treated active shootings as unpredictable and unusually threatening in their scope. So as one chief noted, active shootings, I don't like to call them school shootings because they can be also workplace and other places. Those are up. I read the intelligence bulletins and it's happening at the national level, but that doesn't mean it can't happen here. And then finally, police talked about active shootings in ways that consistently emphasize the unambiguous status of victims as victims. So one chief told me why the Aurora movie theater shooting was so impactful for him. He says, "Aurora, it seemed commonplace. It wasn't a school. This is a movie theater where there is no security. People go in, they buy a ticket, they let their guard down. They are sitting and eating their red vines and popcorn, and they are vulnerable. They lose consciousness of place and time." So thus my interviews with police chiefs revealed a very different way of understanding tropes of gun violence in suburban and rural areas as opposed to urban areas. Framing active shootings as acts of terror resisted the normalization and naturalization of this brand of gun violence. It helped emphasize the unambiguous status of victims as victims, and when juxtaposed with how police constructed urban gun violence, suggested that police shifted between two frames for understanding guns in society, what I call gun militarism and gun populism. So gun militarism refers to an embrace of tough on crime policy, tough on crime, zero tolerance gun policies that aim to police by aggressively disarming would-be criminals and enhancing police's own firepower vis-a-vis the communities they police. So perhaps not surprisingly, police chiefs across Arizona, California, and Michigan revealed an aggressive embrace for these tough on crime policies that disarm and punish criminal gun offenders. They insisted that gun crime required a uniquely tough approach because it reflected irredeemable criminal propensity, unlike drug crime, the other key target of mandatory minimum sentencing, as Chief Smith, an Arizona chief, illustrates here. Second, they insisted that courts are generally overburdened in addressing criminal activity, and thus tougher sanctions are required, as this Michigan chief Raymond notes. And finally, they argued that as police retool and even roll back the war on crime, as has happened in California, they're jeopardizing public order, especially with regard to gun crime, as California Chief Kelly illustrates here. So this embrace of tough on crime gun sanctions resonates with police sentiment in the 1980s and 1990s, when police stood with gun control advocates, not because necessarily of a general stance toward gun policy, but because they saw gun control as a critical tool in waging a war against urban criminals. Now, punitive gun laws that targeted the hardened criminal were attractive not simply because they appeared criminologically or criminologically prudent, but also because they resonated with the racial politics of crime. Now, this logic of racialized criminalization was most visibly at stake in how police marked out the limits of self-defense for individuals imagined as criminals or potential criminals. So when I asked one chief about whether he had any justifiable homicides in his jurisdiction, he approvingly responded, "We've had them. We had one with a jewelry store where the merchant was armed and shot back on a group of armed robbers. One of the guys died in front of the store in the parking lot, and we tracked them down and charged them with felony murder." Now, the felony murder doctrine makes a person liable criminally for a murder if a co-conspirator kills someone or if a death is a reasonably foreseeable consequence in the commission of a violent felony. In referencing felony murder, then, many police chiefs adhered to a one-drop rule of criminal involvement, whereby drug dealing, gangbanging, and other crimes both indicated criminal depravity as well as rescinded a right to self-defense. In this particular excerpt, though, the category of felony murder allows this chief to align himself legally and morally with an armed citizen defending a jewelry business, and not unlike mandatory minimums and sentencing enhancements, self-defense in this story actually operates here as an additional means of criminalization above and beyond the underlying felony. Such sentiment aligns with writer and professor of English Sarita McFadden's note in the aftermath of the killing of Trayvon Martin that only in America can a Black boy stand trial for his own murder. Now, this discussion of gun militarism and racialized criminalization perhaps may not sound particularly new or innovative. After all, what I've described here reflects not just my research findings, but an established body of literature that documents the relationship between police and communities of color. But this setup is essential for understanding gun populism and how the specter of active shootings, in contrast to urban gun violence, provided a very different way for police to understand, imagine, and embrace guns in society. Indeed, active shootings did not just frame how police understood gun violence out there in the world, it also changed how police understood their own guns. In particular, their guns provided an essential way to avoid the shame, devastation, and embarrassment of inadequately responding to an active shooting. As one chief told me, if you have an ability to carry a gun, it is your responsibility to do so and intervene should there be an attack. Say I'm in a movie theater and there's a shooting and I'm there, but I can't do anything because I don't have a gun. I would feel devastated, ashamed, guilty. I would feel like all of those lives were lost on me and it would ruin me forever. And I just want to point out that shame, guilt, devastation, these words were never used in the context of urban gun violence as police describe their roles as crime fighters in that context. Now, the social constructive of active shootings as a particular kind of gun violence made possible a new way of imagining the distribution of legitimate violence across state and society, namely gun populism, which mobilized enthusiasm for armed civilians as generative of social order. Across Arizona, California, and Michigan, police embraced the trope of armed citizens as productive of social order and questioned the logic of top-down legislative maneuvers that clip the power of the good guys to have guns. For example, Arizona Chief Alexander told me, if you think about the shootings that have happened in malls, in schools, if someone with training and experience with a weapon would have been there, they could have stopped all that bloodshed. And that's okay in my book. Michigan Chief Richardson agreed, not only that he supported gun carry, but he felt safer with more civilians carrying guns. And finally, California Chief Wexel made the point that gun laws are often too weak on the real criminal and too harsh on the good guys with guns. Now, scouring through instances where police embrace or gun populism, I found a pattern that code words associated with white middle-class respectability, the good guys with guns, disproportionately animate the populist sensibilities of police. So consider this California chief's discomfort with gun control efforts aimed at barring felons from banning guns or possessing guns. So this is what he told me. That's where I come up with a little bit of a problem. I've had issues with, say, you have a guy who is arrested and convicted for a white collar felony, but now he's a tax-paying family person. You know, not that that's the only thing that's important, but I'm trying to paint a picture. Yes, it would be someone like you and me, and you can look at me as he's, you know, pulling me into this narrative. And so maybe this person has a hiccup when they were younger, they made a mistake, and so now he can't go hunting, you know, something that doesn't have anything to do with gun crime, but he's banned. In these and other cases, this implicit presumption of white middle-class masculine identity, whether the hunter, for example, or the taxpayer here, operated as protective of police intrusion, police harassment, and even violence, suggesting that the other side of gun militarism isn't just a lack of over-enforcement, it's a distinct logic of under-policing, one characterized by an assumption of innocence and even impunity. Okay. So I want to try and get through this last exhibit, although I do recognize that I'm already low on time. But what I want to do here, after having looked at a historical foundation for the contemporary intersection of the politics of police, the politics of guns, and the politics of race, having looked at what police say about guns, gun policy, and gun violence, I want to now shed some light on whether and how these racial frameworks that I've laid out here shape not just the context in which police maneuver and the conversations that police have, but also the actions that police undertake. So to do so, as I've already mentioned, I turn to gun boards in Wayne County and Oakland County. And again, these are places where claimants who have either had a gun license to carry a firearm or have applied for one, where those applications or licenses are revoked, denied, or suspended, and the gun board serves as a forum for them to contest that decision. So these observations, again, provide a rare look at how the limits of legitimate violence, that is gun licensing, are contested, negotiated, and enforced. So based on the nearly 1,000 cases that I observed, I witnessed disparities in terms of who was called to gun board, whether considering the overall racial breakdown of the population in these counties or the racial breakdown of concealed pistol license holders. African-American claimants were vastly overrepresented among people who were called to gun board in my sample of observations. But just as crucial was how people were processed differently once they got to gun board. So to make sense of gun board as a site of racialization and the gun license itself as a tool of racial discipline, I approached these hearings as ritualized degradation ceremonies that, in the words of sociologist Harold Garfinkel, affect the ritual destruction of the person denounced through the deployment of what sociologist Patricia Hill Collins calls controlling images, such as the racist stereotype of the thug and the deadbeat dad. So as legal scholar Nicole Van Cleve discusses in her book on Cook County courts, which is called Crook County, such ceremonies are used to impart moralizing and degrading lessons to claimants, in other words, to discipline them. So in my observation, I found two controlling images at play that communicated to African-American claimants the terms upon which they could obtain a gun carry license. The thug, which describes the controlling image of Black men as hyper-aggressive, out-of-control super predators, and the deadbeat dad, which describes the controlling image of Black men as delinquent providers who are prone to violence within the home. So I want to give you some review or some insight into how this played out in the gun board in my last couple minutes that I have. So the gun license at its core is a permit that regulates public behavior, carrying a gun in public, and the standards for contact with police are built into the legal framework of gun licensing. Someone could be referred to the gun board either because they didn't disclose the fact that they were carrying a gun, they were licensed to carry a gun and were carrying a gun to police if they were had police contact, or if they had what the board considers quote unquote excessive police contact. As you can see, the cases involving police contact were disproportionately involved African-American claimants. Now, what I saw, and I'm not gonna have time to go through and read these in detail, was that African-American claimants were often lectured. They were often told to internalize the image of the thug as sort of the way that police would approach them and see them as armed private civilians. So, for example, gun carriers would have to undergo lectures. They would have to go. They were sometimes quizzed by gun board about how to properly hold oneself if they were stopped stop by police. As another context in which racialization occurred, domestic life cases, so cases involving intimate partner violence, child support, child custody, were also at play and disproportionately involved African American claimants. And this case, I will also go through this pretty fast since I'm running out of time. In these cases also, I witnessed lecturing. I witnessed not just the claimants themselves, but their partners being questioned and lectured as part of the process for appealing a gun board licensing decision. Now, the key here is not just the sort of discipline and lecturing and sort of moralizing lessons that African Americans received, but also that whites did not receive these lessons. Whites were not lectured. They were much more likely to be approached in a joking tone, and they were much more likely to be treated with respect. So accordingly, my observations suggest not just that there are racial disparities in gun law enforcement, which we can see based on the numbers and the figures and the statistics, but that there's actually racial discipline at work as well, that specifically African Americans and not whites are compelled to internalize controlling images as a condition of being licensed to carry a gun. Okay, so I know I went through that pretty fast, so I'm happy to come back to it for the Q&A, but I want to wrap up now since I'm already over time. And so I want to move on to I want to briefly state some of the implications of my research and then move on to your questions and comments. I hope that I've built my case, at least to open up a case, I guess, through the 3 exhibits emphasized here, so that we can so that I've been able to provide some insight into these questions as well as provide a starting point for conversation. So I'd like to end then by highlighting some implications with regard to gun policy. So first, I hope that I have convinced you that police attitudes on guns cannot be presumed a priori based on alleged professional interests or politics of the police. Rather than assume police are invested in a monopoly on legitimate violence, I suggest that we must think beyond the thin blue line, or rather ask when the thin blue line becomes symbolically turned to red to include everyday Americans, and how this, as this Blue Lives Matter flag intimates, actually bolsters rather than undermines police legitimacy and power. Second, I want to emphasize the ways in which the violence of guns and the violence of law can place the most vulnerable people in the United States in a double bind, especially as the violence of law is rallied to address the violence of guns. To call police violence gun violence is a hollow claim without also taking seriously how gun policies that harness the criminal justice apparatus may end up replacing one vector of harm and trauma with another. And last, my analysis provides some cues for rethinking the terms of the contemporary gun debate. So rather than gun control and gun rights, I would argue that gun militarism and gun populism are better equipped to illuminate how the politics of race and crime undergird gun politics and gun policy, whether those policies restrict or deregulate guns. Reframing the gun debate, furthermore, also, I would argue, opens up new ways of imagining gun policy and gun politics. So on this point, I think there's much to learn from those working to reduce or even eliminate criminal justice system reliance as a means of addressing social problems above and beyond criminal problems. Such efforts have taken a variety of forms, from prison abolitionism to the defund the police movement. So I think one of the things that my research leads me to ask and leads us to question is, what would it look like to apply abolitionism to gun politics? Rather than a hypothetical question, a variety of community-led initiatives have already implemented approaches to gun violence that prioritize trauma-informed healing and violence interruption rather than reliance on the criminal justice system. Though not all of these initiatives eliminate any and all relationships with the criminal justice system in general and the police in particular, they provide important examples of how police can be discentered from gun policy. Likewise, President Biden's pledge of $5 billion to community violence prevention programs could be a crucial turning point in transforming the terrain of gun policy, gun politics, and gun violence, depending, of course, on whether this initiative breaks with previous propensities to link community funding with funding for criminal justice. Gun abolitionism, of course, would be the start of a very different kind of conversation than we've had thus far in this country about guns. And so with that, I'd like to end this presentation and open up the conversation for the discussants and the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Carlson. We're now going to have Mudia Uzzi be our first discussant with some remarks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carlson, for your amazing talk. I really learned a lot from your book and also from sort of the presentation. Some of the things that I was really struck by was basically your kind of historical way of viewing sort of like the way that of the engagement of police and guns, and particularly as well the sort of ambivalent views of Black communities around guns and control, and how that leads to sort of the tensions of sort of criminal justice reforms and gun control, and also just the way that you were able to use the gun boards to kind of look at sort of the racialized frameworks that police kind of use to both to act basically around sort of their racialized views around gun control. And so my question, I have one question related to your presentation, and it's connected to sort of what you were mentioning in the beginning about the rise in gun ownerships of Black communities, particularly, and other communities of color within the United States. And we've seen that sort of like Black communities, queer communities, and other communities that have been marginalized have increased their gun ownership in the past year, particularly new gun owners. And then also tied to that, there are organizations that might be a counterweight to the NRA, so sort of the National African American Gun Association, Pink Pistols, and whatnot. And so I was just wondering how this rise and sort of gun ownership among these historically marginalized communities kind of fit within the context of your ideas around gun populism and gun militarism and legitimate violence. Does it complicate it? What is it? What are your views around that, basically? I'm sure I hope that makes sense.
Should I go ahead and jump in, or okay? Yeah, I mean, that's an incredible question, and I think that's like it's more than $1 million. It's like the $1 billion question of 2020 with respect to guns. Well, one of the $1 billion questions from 2020, which is we see all these this vast increase, and I think the numbers are still not totally clear, but by some accounts, 8 million new gun owners, and these are people who are not the quote unquote traditional gun owners. So whether it's racial demographics, gender, political persuasion, they're breaking from that mold in some way, in large part. And so, yeah, that's the big question: is will this? It comes down to the sort of social identity question of, does owning a gun make one a gun owner, and what does a gun owner mean politically in a post 2020 context where there's been this massive surge. And so as far as so I think that there's, I think it's, what I love about this question is that I think it's always important to think top down and bottom up. That, when we think about the National Rifle Association, when we think about gun policy enforcement, there's a lot of top down dynamics that are shaping the terrain of sort of the social life of guns, and then bottom up dynamics in terms of, great, okay, so the NRA is saying this, they're pressing this, this image of the gun owner, this politics attached to gun ownership, but what are everyday people who are actually owning guns? What are they doing? What do they think? What do guns matter to them? And so I think that since the 1970s, and if you haven't read Matt Lacombe's new book, Firepower, it's just an amazing clarifying book in the way that it lays out sort of the transformation of the NRA and how the NRA has not just become the quote unquote, gun lobby that it is, that we recognize it to be, but that the NRA has really done something incredible in terms of attaching what it means to be a gun owner to this whole other sort of set of political ideologies, a political party, the Republican Party, and really has narrowly defined what, in some ways, what it means to be a gun owner and what it means to participate in gun culture. So I think that, to answer your question, I think that to the extent that, sort of the sort of stereotypical traditional understandings of what a gun owner is and what gun culture is and what gun politics is are disrupted by that. And by that, I really mean like the NRA's sort of capacity to define what a gun owner is. I think that is where we'll see shifts in terms of this broader terrain, because the fact is that this is not new. That for example, African Americans would, obviously I talked about the Black Panthers, I talked about Ida B. Wells, there's tons of other organizations. And of course, what the Second Amendment means or how it is mobilized in those contexts is distinctive. It's much more of, I would argue, imagined as I don't want to quite say collective right, but a right mobilized on behalf of a collective rather than on behalf of an individual, which is usually how, when we read Heller, it's individual, individual, individual. The Black Panther Second Amendment is not Heller's Second Amendment, I would argue, because of that. And so, yeah, so I think that this is not historically new, but it seems more historically new than it should be, perhaps, because of the way the sort of dominant understanding of gun politics, I would say, and I'm very much influenced by Matt Lacombe's book, defined by the NRA, the gun rights side, has really taken hold in sort of the popular imagination of what gun rights are.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Nick Meyerson now to share his thoughts.
Thanks, Daniel. So just first, echo what Mudia had said before. Thank you, Dr. Carlson, for taking this time. It's definitely unfortunate we only had an hour to get through such impactful work. Something like this definitely would require multiple sessions just to really even get through like chapter 1 of your book. But something that really stood out to me, like in your book and in the presentations today, is how these police chiefs were addressing these two types of gun violence. We had the urban gun violence, which you said was associated with mainly Black Americans, and active shooters or rural gun violence, which is more so associated with white perpetrators. And it felt like when it came to urban gun violence, the answer was incarceration, lock them up and throw in the key. While with active shooters or with white perpetrators, it was more so about mental health, about this is almost an anomaly. This isn't normal for this community. They're evil. So it's upsetting in a way to hear these words from leaders in policing, that the way we address issues that involve Black Americans is to lock them away and not have them see the light of day again. While the issue with white Americans, it's almost like white violence can be cured, while Black violence is almost expected. And I feel that sentiment is really driving the racial and ethnic disparities we just not only see with gun violence, but throughout in inequalities that exist in every foundation of society. I don't know, with the limited time left, Daniel, if you want me to pose my question or if you want to go Q&A, because I know there was a lot of things popping up in there.
Look, if you got a question, go for it.
So I know we were talking about it a little bit before. Recently, the Supreme Court had decided to take on a gun case from New York State, ruling on if the Second Amendment applies to outside the home. So I guess my thought is, beginning your book, you talk a lot about Philando Castile, that this is a Black American who had his concealed carry license, who wanted to show the officer that, but the threat perception was, this is a Black man who says he has a gun. I feel threatened now for the officer. So the ramifications of the Supreme Court case, that they say that the Second Amendment also applies to guns outside the home, do you feel that we'll just see more instances just like Philando Castile? Do you feel we'll just have a repeat of the Mulford Act, where now we're going to put a law forward that's aiming to disarm Black Americans like they had done with the Black Panther Party? So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Mulford Act is really interesting. Well, okay, so first of all, with the Supreme Court, this case, it actually would affect, in terms of people living in states across the U.S., it would actually affect, a handful of states, right? It would not affect me in Arizona. It would not affect me, the people living in states that already have, fairly robust concealed pistol licensing apparatus that allow people to get licenses, or the permitless right to carry, constitutional carry, whatever you want to call it, those apparatuses already in place. So I think that, in some ways this is really, this is a case about New York, California, states that don't have the shall issue system already. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing, I think I'm really glad you bring up Mulford. So Mulford is, was a law that was very explicitly passed in the 1960s in California that, I mean, there's no like reading between the lines. This was the law meant to disarm the Black Panthers who were, active, across California, particularly in Oakland, where they were founded. And the idea was to ban loaded open carry to essentially disarm them. And the law was written in such a way that it wouldn't affect, hunters in non-incorporated areas. It wouldn't affect people who were organized, white supremacist militias, the Minutemen, all of these things. So, and that's not, I mean, there's not a lot of debate in terms of that law. What I find interesting about that law is that in some ways, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, I think it is sort of an anachronism in the sense that it actually looks a lot more like the laws we saw in the Jim Crow South. That basically create, that kind of drew lines that were pretty explicitly racialized with respect to who could have access to guns. What we see in sort of the post-1960s context is that restrictions based on guns, and I'm using that, or restrictions of guns, and I'm using that very, very broadly because I think that's necessary to really make sense of what's going on in the US context, are those laws are going to look like gun criminalization. So they're going to look like tough on crime laws. They're not going to look like gun control that we might see in places like Australia or England or Canada or what have you. So I would expect that we wouldn't see something like Mulford, that we would probably see a doubling down on, sort of tough on crime laws that would still have effectively have the same outcome, but they wouldn't be sort of the Jim Crow style. They would be very much in this sort of tough on crime style of what I call gun criminalization.
Okay, so I want to share something from the Q&A from Nina Vinnick with the Joyce Foundation. She wanted me to do a plug, which I'm very happy to do. They've been having a great series on research relevant to guns and gun violence. And on May 26th, Deborah Azrael and Dr. Matthew Miller will share some new findings, research looking at surveys of people who purchased guns during the COVID pandemic, because a lot of information coming out thus far is coming from the industry. So that'll be really important information from these important scholars. Thank you, Nina. I'm just going to sort of, the very last question, there are several questions here, so I'm just picking one that I think may be most substantive to your research, Dr. Carlson, which is if you could say a little bit more about denials and revocations of CCW permits based upon police findings of quote unquote propensity for violence. Mm-hmm. So if you could say just a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that's so the equivalent of what I saw in my research would be danger to self and others. And so this is actually, I find it so fascinating that there's, this kind of narrative that shall issue laws are non-discretionary, and that it's not like the discretionary may issue system, but in fact there is discretion built in, and danger to self and others is one of the key places that comes to play. So here's what I found that was really interesting about my data, which is that I expected to see a lot of denials. Like I expected to see, any opportunity that gun board had to deny, that they would be, throwing the book, slamming, and denying, revoking, and what have you. And in many of the cases, what I found, which was really paradoxical, or paradoxical if you think that it's just all about sort of restricting guns and not about sort of the racial politics that I laid out, is that what would often happen in these cases, even cases that, as sort of an outsider watching this and not being necessarily, intricately aware of sort of the norms and the complex legal structure that these boards were navigating, I would think this person has to be denied. There's no way that this person is going to walk away with their license. Generally, they would reinstate, they would provide some way to get that license back, but only after this sort of, what I would say, like putting people through the ringer, particularly African Americans, lecturing them, provide not just individuals, but like actually there were times that I saw the whole auditorium of people being lectured about sort of, you have to be responsible, you have to realize that people are going to, accuse you of being the aggressor just because you have the gun, and so on and so forth. Something that I never saw again with, but for like a handful of cases saw with white claimants. So I think that that's actually what I realized when I was watching these licensing proceedings, which is that it's not simply about sort of enforcing and seizing, taking guns away. It's also about discipline and also about asserting the terms on which people can carry guns. So I think that's sort of really the core that I found that was really illuminating and really made me recognize sort of the work that gun laws are doing that we often don't recognize because we're so focused on sort of the just like the numbers, the disparities, and not also what the laws themselves are doing to how people understand themselves as an legally armed person in the US.
Well, thank you. I mean, boy, that really underscores the importance of the kind of research that you do, Dr. Carlson, that not only looks at the data, but really is part of the observations that are so key to really understanding how gun policy works. We really thank you for your scholarship on this important issue, for this really engaging conversation, and and I'm glad that our students got to be engaged in this as well. Thank you, Nick and Mudia as well. And thanks to all of you who tuned in to our webinar and for your questions. I'm sorry we could not get to them all in 1 hour. Dr. Carlson did a remarkable job of jamming in a lot of information. I gave her maybe not enough time. So maybe we'll think about some repeat engagement where we can talk more, because I know you have more interesting stuff that you're doing now, of course, on trauma as well, that is incredibly relevant to many of us in public health. So again, thank you for your work and for joining us in our webinar.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, bye.